Hello and welcome to the Drexel Interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from my office as Dean of the Pennoni Honors College at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today my guest is Christopher Atkins, the Agnes and Jack Mulroney Associate Curator of European Painting and Sculpture before 1900 at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I've invited Mr. Atkins here today after seeing his 2015 exhibit at the Philadelphia Museum entitled The Wrath of the Gods, Masterpieces by Rubens, Michelangelo, and Titian. That exhibit was so beautifully curated and so compelling that I thought an overview of it would transfer well to the Drexel Interview. We will therefore discuss some of the key images and insights from that exhibit in our program today. Christopher Atkins, welcome to the Drexel Interview.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, before we talk about the exhibit itself, I wonder if you could give us just a brief overview of what's involved when you stage an exhibit like this. Is this your idea? Does it come from others at the museum? Do you have to lobby for it? What's involved in an idea like this one?
Well, it can happen in a variety of ways. Ideas can be generated by all sorts of people, often by the curators, but often also can come from our director or a collaborative discussion. And so we come up with an idea. And then we try and see whether we can make it happen. We develop a checklist, a wish list of the things that we would like to present, to tell our stories. And then we actually have to go about trying to persuade our colleagues to lend their great works of art to us to make that happen.
I guess we forget sometimes that you're so dependent on having other works of art. And in this case, of course, you needed certain key works to complete the exhibit. I want to talk about it. The title was The Wrath of the Gods, Masterworks by Rubens, Michelangelo, and Titian. But Peter Paul Rubens was, in fact, the focal point for the exhibit. And Rubens was a Flemish painter who lived between 1577 and 1640. And you're interested in this exhibit in tracing the influence of other key artists on Rubens and his influence on others in terms of one particular painting. So tell us first a little bit about Rubens himself and his background as a painter.
Sure. So Rubens was one of the great artists of his age, one of the great masters of the Flemish Baroque. He was born in exile in Siegen in modern-day Western Germany. His father was in exile for religious reasons, and he grew up but he then moved back and grew up in what was his hometown of Antwerp in modern-day Belgium, and lived there for quite some time before he, like many artists of his day, decided to go to Italy, see the great works of art of particularly the Renaissance as well as antiquity, and be inspired. And then he came back and established himself as a working master in Antwerp in about 1610. But he went on to become the leading artist of his day. He worked for the Regent of France. He was knighted twice by the King of Spain and the King of England. He was an international figure.
So this painting that is at the center of this exhibit is Prometheus Bound. It was begun in 1611 and finished in 1618, so it took some time to do. Tell us about the figure, Prometheus, that is central to it. What is the mythic story behind Prometheus?
Prometheus, it comes from ancient myth. Prometheus was a Titan. He was immortal, and there are many narrative moments that get pulled out, but among them are, as the Titan, he ascended Mount Olympus. He stole fire from the gods. For this act, he was punished. Zeus had him chained to a mountain where an eagle would come and attack him and rip out his liver. As an immortal, this happened day after day, depending on which version of the story you read, may have happened for hundreds of years. It's a story of eternal punishment, of anguish, of lots of other things, ultimately creation. But Prometheus is this enslaved figure.
So the liver is constantly being torn out by a hawk?
An eagle.
An eagle,
yep.
And then grows back again to be torn out again. It's sort of a Sisyphean kind of element to that.
Absolutely, and he's often linked as a figure because of this ongoing torture is often linked to Sisyphus and some other figures who endure these horrible punishments at the hands of the gods.
What's interesting is he is heroic too, because he stole fire from the gods to to man. So there's that other part of the story,
Absolutely.
which is also sometimes represented.
Yeah, he's a complex figure. He's a complex figure, which I think is part of the power of the narrative and, by extension, our painting of Prometheus Bound. Because, yeah, what does he do with the fire? He gives fire to humanity, from which all sorts of things. It's sometimes, depending on the telling, it's the literal fire. Sometimes the metaphorical. It's the spark, the creative spark, the spark of the imagination, the spark of creativity. And and it's a myth that goes on. This idea of taking the torch and passing it along. The phrase in English, passing the torch, comes from the story of Prometheus.
What's interesting about this Rubens painting is that although he was, as you say, a great master at the time he painted it, he nonetheless collaborated on it with another painter who painted the eagle,
Yes.
Franz Snyder. Tell us about that, and was that unusual for two artists of note to collaborate on a massive work like this?
It was a practice that was actually somewhat common in this very small locale and in this particular point in time. For about 100 years, it was a practice that did occur in Antwerp in the 16th and 17th century. We don't tend to think of it as particularly common, but it really was. I think of it in musical terms. It's a duet. It's two masters working together. What's better than one masterpiece? Well, two working together. And so in this case, Snyder's was a painter of international renown in his own right. He was a specialist in painting animals and flowers. And so I think we often don't know exactly, but what I think happened was that Rubens, as the great figure painter, great composer of a scene, had this story of which the eagle is protagonist or antagonist, depending on how you read it. So he needed the best eagle possible, so he reached out to the ultimate eagle painter, Franz Snyder.
It's a wonderful idea of collaboration. So the exhibit deals with this painting as its centerpiece, but the influence of particularly Titian and Michelangelo on it are central as well. And, you know, Rubens, as you say, was a northern painter, and Michelangelo and Titian were Italians. And you mentioned that there was some travel by Rubens. What did he see of these artists' work? I mean, it's all speculative, I assume. What's your thought?
It's largely speculative, but at the same time, we can retrace a number of his steps. We know where Rubens was at certain periods of time. There's letters that he wrote that survive, so we can place him in certain locations at certain times, and then when we connect that with where works of art were there at particular points of time, we can surmise what he saw. So he traveled, so Rubens traveled. He went to Italy, he went to Venice, which is the home of Titian, where so many things were. He also worked for the Duke of Mantua, who had a fantastic collection of paintings by Titian. He also saw Titian's work in Spain, where Rubens also went. He was an envoy and later an ambassador, and he saw all the great things, the things that you could go if you go to the Prado in Madrid today, Rubens could have seen. He also spent time in Rome. Rubens was an amazing traveler. In his lifetime, we know that he traveled to over 50 European cities, which in 17th century terms is really quite amazing. And in Rome, he could see all sorts of things, the sculptures. He could see the Sistine Chapel. He could see works on paper, all sorts of things by Michelangelo as well.
So he no doubt saw the two works that you focus on. One, and they're both not of Prometheus, but of another figure, related figure, Tityus.
Yes.
Is that the pronunciation?
Yes, that's right.
Tell us about this figure and how he is like and unlike Prometheus. This was the subject of both the Titian and the Michelangelo works that influenced Rubens.
Yes, so Tityus was also a figure from mythology who was punished. He was punished, chained, and attacked by a bird of prey. What the difference is with Tityus is why was he punished? Tityus is an irredeemable figure, basically attempted sexual assault. Whereas Prometheus, as we were saying, is a complex figure and can be read as both thief and hero. Tityus, no way, he's a villain. But visually, large hulking figure, chained, attacked by a bird, iconographically, they're pretty close, and even sometimes we're confused between the two.
So Titian and Michelangelo, both of whom with these figures of Tityus influenced Rubens, are giants of the high Renaissance, each one known particularly for different elements, color and design. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about that and how in Rubens those two aspects of style are combined.
So color and design are what were set up as sort of two of the primary modes of aesthetic creation from the Italian Renaissance. Color, design. Let's start there. Michelangelo was the key proponent of design, which meant how you designed a work of art, how you made a composition, that sort of design. It also translated down to more the micro level of drawing, of the beautiful execution of line that marked and locked in a design.
Do you think it's connected to as being more a sculptor than a painter?
It can be. It's the way of working. It's related to a way of working. Rubens was exclusively a painter, but it could be in some parts. But its design has connotations of thought and preparation, making a detailed sketch beforehand and then translating that sketch into a final product. The alternative of color, which is both literally color and the expressive possibilities of color and how it can convey emotion, also translated into ways of manufacture, whereas Titian, in contrast to making a detailed drawn design, worked directly on the canvas, worked in oil sketches. So he was always thinking in terms of color and paint and the transformation of the material, rather than locking in a line. But so for Titian on that other opposite was indeed about expressive power and emotion, but communicated not through line but through color.
And Rubens synthesized both, in your view.
Yes, and this is what he was famous for already by the end of the 17th century in the French academies in the 18th century. This is what Rubens he created: bold, dynamic images that were expressive, that connoted emotion, conveyed feeling, but they were also extremely well plotted and thought out. And Rubens, I think, intentionally tried to synthesize these two things, to bring together what were positioned for him as different modes, as putting them together into the single image. What could be better if these are the two great choices? What would be even better would be to bring them together.
And that works as a sort of dialectic for moving out of the High Renaissance into the Baroque, I guess.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Let's look at Titian's Tityus,
Yes.
Which was painted in 1548, I believe 48-49.
Yes.
And could you tell us what in this painting we should think about in terms of what Rubens took from it in his Prometheus?
So it's an extremely large picture. Bear with me with a couple of qualifications, but it is the largest non-religious painting on canvas of the entire Renaissance. So it's huge. It's huge. It's about 9 feet by 8 feet. This is an absolutely enormous picture that takes a single figure and writ large, and something that we must have sort of, for how this must have seemed to Rubens was like seeing something on the big screen, something that just filled his field of vision and just encapsulated and pictured a giant as an actual giant, someone larger than life. It's also with dramatic coloring. It's very evocative. It's very moody, and of course, the figure of Tityus, who's being tortured, is shown as being tortured. His torso is ripped apart. It's this gaping chest wound, and really conveys that sense of power and feeling and anguish. And I think that's very much what Rubens saw, and that's what then he tried to emulate and synthesize into his own works.
So let's move to Michelangelo now. Tell us about the Tityus of Michelangelo and how it influenced Rubens' Prometheus Bound.
So Michelangelo's Tityus is on a completely different scale, completely different medium. It's a drawing. It's a drawing. It's one of the. It's a finished drawing, by which we mean it is not a preparatory sketch for another work of art. It stands alone as an independent work of art, and it was world famous in its day. It was mentioned in Vasari's Lives of the Artists, one of the first works of art history, and who was written by Michelangelo's colleague Vasari. And so it's a drawing of Tityus, which takes this figural composition of the figure and being attacked by the eagle. And we believe that Rubens probably saw this drawing, probably had it in his hands. We know where it was. It had access to this particular collection. And Rubens thought about and very much emulated the figural position of it. So whereas taking the large scale and the expressive power of Titian, he used the specific composition of the figure from Michelangelo.
So that's the design piece, and as opposed to the color piece that came from Titian.
Exactly.
Yeah, and now let's move into that interesting little notation that I you had on a video for the exhibition about how you saw a connection between Rubens' Prometheus and the Risen Christ by Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel.
So I was working on the exhibition. I was beginning to, in a relatively early stage of things, and I had a book out. I had a book out, a collection catalog for our museum that has Prometheus Bound on the cover. And so I'd left, and when I came back, I saw the book upside down. And I said, this figure, when you look at it upside down, reminded me of something else. It reminded me of the figure of the risen Christ from the Sistine Last Judgment, which made me think, made me ask questions. Is this possible? Is this true? Is this I immediately tried to go into the file, went through the scholarship to see whether this had been noted before, and it hadn't. So I have to say I wasn't sure of myself at the time. But as I kept on researching, I began to see that it really was. So we put the images side by side. You do a rotation, the powers of digital art history in these days, what you can do on the computer. And when you look at them side by side, you really can see how close they are. And I think that was very important. I think it amplified the story. Rubens was a sponge. He looked at everything, and he was influenced by such a wide variety of material. It would make sense that he wasn't influenced by just two works of art, but also that he was taking a broad spectrum of material and then sort of cooking it together and ultimately distilling it into something great, but that he would have taken some other sources. And so this particular source was really interesting because it changes the dynamic of the story. It's not only a figural composition, but it reorients our understanding of Prometheus as a figure. If you take the figure of Christ, right, the most positive figure, gives us and relates to these ideas of Prometheus as a hero, that he endured this punishment, as we're talking about, for the sake of mankind. He made a sacrifice. He stole the fire and gave it to humanity. He sacrificed himself for
So he was a
benefit.
precursor of Christ. Do you feel that Rubens intended the viewer to make that connection and see, at the time, the structural relationship?
I think he did, and we have to remember who he was working for. He was an intellectual himself, and he was working for an informed intellectual group of individuals. And so I think they would have recognized it, or he would have at least hoped that they would recognize it. Maybe it wasn't on the first viewing, maybe it was hidden enough that they could have seen it on multiple viewings and something came to them.
So other influences on Rubens, I mean, you said he was like a sponge. Were there other major paintings or painters that you can point to that have informed this work?
Well, this work, I think, was also informed by works of what were local inspirations for Rubens, painters of Northern European origin. One figure who's not very well known today is Mikhail Coxey, but in the 16th century was a very important figure. His name doesn't resonate like Michelangelo and Titian today, but in Northern European circles, he was an important figure. He painted for the Habsburgs. He went to Rome as well. And there's a wonderful painting in the exhibition of Coxey's The Death of Abel. That I believe Rubens saw. Rubens saw this and was also inspired. And here, what he takes from this idea is turning the figure upside down. And when you began to look in Coxey, but then also prints in a variety of pictorial sources in the period, you see that in late 16th century Northern Europe, they had a certain taste for large muscled men turned upside down, whatever that means.
What does that mean? Your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, part of it is an aesthetical horror. You know,
Yeah.
What is horrific? You have these hulking bodies, and they should be able to withstand punishment, and they should at least be able to stand upright. But then to turn them upside down is very unsettling. To see somebody upside down, and I think it's even more so to be unsettling to see someone who looks like they've just stepped out of the gym. You know, who's been just really
Toppled.
working out,
Yeah.
toppled and powerless.
Interesting. Now, this collaborative and synthetic aspect of Rubens, where he would take from so many different and collaborated with Snyder for the painting. Was that common, or was this just particular to Rubens? Was there something about the Baroque or the High Renaissance leading into the Baroque where this tendency to teamwork, so to speak, was in the air?
Difficult to answer. Well, by the Baroque, they were coming after the Renaissance, and,
Yeah.
and very much as the Renaissance had looked to antiquity, many of the later artists of the 17th century, the Baroque, then could take that same idea and build upon it, and build upon the artists of the recent past as well as those of the ancient past. What's always interesting is how do you build upon the works of the past, the greats of the past, as well as to create your own individual style, your own individual method, and I think that's where it gets extremely difficult.
What a wonderful figure. You know, I will never look at his work again with the same eyes now that I've got some backstory. What about his influence
Yes.
on others?
Rubens was extremely influential in turn, just as he had been influenced by great works of the past and great masters of the past. That story continues. He was a great teacher, and in this particular exhibition, we linked him to the work of Rubens, who was a generation younger but a Flemish contemporary, who very much was enamored of Rubens' style and aesthetic, and of course the fame and riches that he achieved as a result. But Rubens' fame was far-reaching in his own lifetime. It was inspired Italian artists as well. We often think about the dialogue going from south to north, but it then came from north to south again. And then in succeeding generations, almost all the major figures of the Rococo, Boucher and Fragonard into the 19th century, of Delacroix, and so forth, and all sorts of figures throughout the history of art have turned to Rubens because he's this monumental creative genius. I think Rubens is one of the best of all time, frankly. I mean, it's always it becomes splitting hairs if you try and make some sort of judgment, but he's a fantastic figure.
When you put together an exhibition like this, what do you learn, or what do you see differently? I mean, has there been a shift or a change in the way you perceive the art that you were dealing with as a result of putting the exhibition together?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and you bring things together for reasons, and you want to see them together. But then once they actually do come together, there are things that you learn. We always talk about our painting, the great Rubens' Prometheus, is this great painterly force. But when you look at it, Titian's, whose brushwork dissolves, it dissolves into these, brushwork, the coloring, and you see it, and then you see sharp outlines along the sides of like Prometheus's body, where don't do this, but it looks like you could take an X-Acto knife and cut it out. He's not that, at that point, it's a different thing, and our painting actually seemed much more controlled. But then there are other things. One of the great.
So wait a second. You're saying that when you put it next to the Titian, it seemed much more controlled than you had thought of it before.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you see something in isolation, you consider it one way. But then when you make that visual comparison, things can be different. We see all sorts of things. And then when you have a chance to see them time over time, the Coxey, for example, that I mentioned, was looking at how Rubens and this idea of how Rubens rotated figures and played with them. I think actually, it didn't occur to me until seeing it in the exhibition. I think Coxey was doing the same thing. I think he also had figural sources, interestingly also Michelangelo, that I think he was playing with, and he was repositioning them and figuring them, and so maybe that process that Rubens had, he also was developing.
And I'm sure now you will always be thinking about rotating figures.
I'm always trying to turn them upside down. Maybe there's something else I can
say. How do you feel when an exhibition closes like this, which you must, I can just feel you put your heart and soul into it, so much about you and your intellect, and you're putting things together. Do you feel a sadness when it's over?
I do. It was a great exhibition for me. I enjoyed it all the time. I loved walking by and seeing people in it. I loved giving tours to people and really interacting with people in front of the works of art. And so then when we put them in the crates and shipped them off again.
Do you think it's rare to have an exhibition that's this compact? Is that what you try for? Is that something that you're going to want to do again? Often exhibits are much more diffuse. This has so much of a nice rigor to it. Do you think about that when you think about putting together an exhibit?
Well, I think that's one of the things that we've learned. It was a bit of an experiment for us, because usually as an institution we do big sprawling stories. And this was a different story. It was very compact, it was very focused. Every work of art told an aspect of that story. And we tried we did try and keep it small. We tried to create power moments the best of the best for each of these individual things. And then also, as a tight group, one of the things I liked was we had it in one large single room, but just one room. And so you could see across, you could look in and across, you could see the relationships. Hopefully, whether you had any knowledge of art history or not, you could see this figure looks like that figure, and then get up close and want to explore why. And I hope that's what happened. You know, I think there are certainly moments where this is the right type of approach. And for us, this exhibition started as well as celebrating one of our masterpieces. We have many great things, but sometimes things get lost. When you come to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we have 220,000 objects, 222 galleries. There are many things all over the place, and sometimes you can get lost. And so to dive in a concrete but compact way and really look closely, and always coming back to the work of art. So I would like to see in the future that maybe we could look at some other masterpieces, and maybe we take a similar strategy.
Well, I hope so. I look forward to it. And I want to thank you, Christopher Atkins, for being here today.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.
And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.